We've got Shawn Siegele back on the show. That is the special edition today of RotoViz Overtime. We are back with myself, Colm Kelly, with Shawn Siegele. We've had Blair Andrews on this week to cover the Week 8 action. We had Eric Hove on last week to cover the Week 7 action. We've Shawn Siegele here ahead of Week 9. Excited to have him back on the show. Myself and Shawn talking quite a bit before we started recording today, catching up. But it is great to get back to talk about all things NFL fantasy football. Because, Shawn, there's been a lot of exciting things that have happened over those last couple of weeks with players that we have talked about a lot. And there has been a number of these weeks where I'm thinking, oh, I wish I was able to recap this week with Shawn. Including last week, I did mention it quite a bit on our recap, but Trey McBride having a big week was nice. And we're in a situation, Shawn, entering Week 9 here where we have a lot of Detroit Lions players rostered, and one of those guys that we have rostered pretty much everywhere is Sam Laporta. So we're Sam Laporta less this week, and our main event team, we are slotting in Trey McBride, who was on our bench last week, who we would have been nice, but you can't trust it. But this week we're looking for him to get into those double-digit points, but hopefully to get into those 20s or above. But last week was tremendous. We are going to talk some zero RB universe on today's show. We're going to talk about maybe how to handle some of the bye week as well this week, with people having the likes of a Travis Etienne maybe on their bye, the likes of the Denver Broncos with Javonte Williams and so on. We have a couple of leagues, Shawn, where we are rostering both of those guys, and we're looking for that second running back spot here as we enter this week. And then with the quarterbacks, there's just so many players either on bye, injured, or now at this particular point benched. Maybe not benched in the Atlanta situation. We're still trying to read between the lines there. I think that is a benching, Shawn. Would you agree that is a benching? But we'll see what happens moving forward here. How are you feeling, though, to be back on the podcast? Excited to look ahead to this week's action? Some big picture thoughts?
Yeah, it's awesome to be back. I want to extend a big thank you to Blair and Eric, both doing a fantastic job, and I hope to have them, on some more in the future as well. But Colm, this is the perfect moment to be recording some overtime because our main event team is in first place. Our dynasty team is in first place. I was showing you that a bunch of our sort of random underdog teams, this, that, and the other weird contest that I don't necessarily remember participating in, but definitely enjoyed at the time. Those teams are in first place. And so you just want to celebrate, right? You want to be happy. Heading into Week 9 is not the point in the season that you are targeting. That's not the point you're pointing your season toward. Being in first place after Week 9 doesn't get the job done.
Can you not take victory laps at Week 9? I thought people took victory laps at Week 1 and Week 2 this year.
Well, anytime that things are going well, you want to enjoy it. You want to celebrate it, be grateful for it, because you just don't know, right? And maybe these teams won't hold on. And so you want to be happy in those good moments. That's what life is about. And so, yeah, I'm happy. We're currently in first, and the teams do look good, right? There's no guarantee. We got a lot of players on the bye this week. You can go out there and have a very low score when you have half of your lineup out, but I do like the depth. I like a lot of the players who are going to be filling in. In some of the leagues, the running back 2 spot is not particularly strong this week. And one of the things you're looking at there is what can the other players on your team do? Because it can be easy to get focused in on, okay, well, my overall range of outcomes is going to be shifted down without as many good players in the lineup. If you had teams where both of your starting running backs were very good, then there's a chance that, they could each go for over 25 points in the given week. That helps you. At the same time, so much of what you see when you get these 200-point weeks are that you got those because of huge eruptions of certain guys. You think back to being in the first place. The teams that I have in first place almost all had Trey McBride on the bench last week. Many of them had Sam Howell on the bench last week. And so you don't get points that you might be able to use later in the season, but it also reinforces that, you could get that big score. I always kind of go back to like the very highest score that I ever got in a high stakes league, I think was something like 239. And that was a Tavares Jackson team. And you're not thinking when you have to start him that you're going to score almost 240 points If you remove his score, if you'd had to play without a QB, it would have scored like 222. And so one of the reasons why we're putting these teams together to be talent-based and not workload-based is that when the talent hits in a way that really matters, then you have the chance for these big scores. Because it's not a matter of, okay, how can we cobble together enough 12-point games in order to get to the final total? Yeah, you're going to have some games in there like that. You're going to have some games lower than that. You're going to have some guys who go out and put up, 1 or 2, and those scores don't help in that week, obviously. But you need to have those really big performances to pull you across the line. So as we look at week 9, as we try and figure out how we're going to get it done, the thing that we need, the thing we'll be rooting for on Sunday morning is that you get the big games. Colm, I think that's, what week 9 is going to revolve around. And it kind of brings me to the first sort of big note that I wanted to make here. It's always so fun to put together these Zero RB Universe articles. And for anybody who listens and isn't necessarily a subscriber, you certainly don't have to be. We love to have anybody here listening to the show. But one of the things I'm looking to do with these Zero RB Universe pieces in 2023 is to have it be a sort of a multifaceted article, right? Where there's a portion of it that's looking back and that is saying, this is what the workload and usage was like. There's a part that's looking forward, kind of projecting what that means for the future, at that position on the team, but also then using some of our tools like the matchup tab on the Weekly Explorer, using some of the tools like the fantasy strength of schedule streamer. Obviously, Blair is doing an article late in the week that is, just amazing, where he takes a lot of the information from the advanced team stat explorer to help you understand these matchups. So there's a matchup element looking for the future week. So it's forward looking. And then we're also talking about how can we make some trades and how do we need to address either kind of deep waivers or look ahead waivers to try and figure out how to build the rosters out. So all of those different components to the article and trying to tailor it to the individual depth chart, what's relevant for that team in any given week. But you also run across these elements occasionally that are bigger picture, that are more global in nature. It's always fun when guys are hitting in a way that is unusual, and even for stars is unusual, and you can pull up the RotoViz screener and see how that fits in. And when we talk about how do you get these difference-making performances, one of the things you're looking for is for your first round pick to have hit. Colm have a variety of teams with Christian McCaffrey this year, and what he's doing, again, is really impressive. Now, he's averaging about 25.5 points per game. Anytime you're over 25, obviously you're really coming through with 101 type of production, but not all of that is workload based, right? He is averaging 3.5 rushing fantasy points over expectation and 3.5 receiving fantasy points over expectation, which means he's giving you more than a touchdown's worth of value every week, just in efficiency. That's value that's up and above the workload or the fantasy points that would be implied by the workload. So we look at that and you're like, that's pretty crazy, but obviously, he won't be able to do that for the full season. What are the historical examples of this? The only player I could find who was above 3, so he's at 3.5, right? The only player who's above 3 in both categories this century was Charlie Garner, who was actually at 4.4 and 4.5 over the first 8 weeks. That was 7 games in his case. The second half of the season, he ends up averaging 19.6 fantasy points per game. A good season, not in that 24-25 range that McCaffrey is in. However, if you lower the threshold just a little bit and you look at the total fantasy points over expectation, Breece Holmes in 2002 and Marshall Faulk in 2000 were both averaging even more. Number one, they were averaging more points per game. They were both above 30. But they were averaging even more total FPOE. Again, this is the season's first half. You go to the second half of the season, and these guys increased. They didn't decline. They increased the fantasy points over expectation per game. Breece Holmes in the 6 games from week 9 to week 17, so obviously he misses a little bit there with injury, but in the 6 games, he averaged 28.7 points per game. But of that, 10.6 were fantasy points over expectation. That's how dynamic he was in that Dick Vermeil Kansas City Chiefs offense. Marshall Faulk averaged almost 9 fantasy points over expectation and averaged 33.7 points per game. That, again, at the very height of the greatest show on turf. So in both of those situations, you have that offense, the Dick Vermeil, Mike Martz offense, very strongly connected there. The NFL has changed a lot in the 20 years in between. We know that those two guys, and then with LaDainian Tomlinson, you had huge running back scores that are unique to that historical moment, and you don't get any more in 2023. And yet when we're looking at Christian McCaffrey and being at 25.5 points per game, and you're thinking about what he could do in the future, he's so unique himself as a talent. And then to be in this offense where you have Kyle Shanahan calling the plays, but you also have those other guys in the mix there with Deebo Samuel, who has been injured a little bit, but Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle, you have those 3 additional weapons, and you can't key on Christian McCaffrey. I'm not saying he's going to average 7 fantasy points over expectation per game the rest of the way, but I am saying that this combination of a good environment and an elite talent means that you can put together these types of seasons that are so unusual. And that, I mean, no one's going to trade Christian McCaffrey. No one, you're not going to be able to pick him up if you don't have him. It's not like there are moves to be made here. But when we think about where teams are, where we think about what Christian McCaffrey and the 49ers will be after the bye, there's a lot of room for enthusiasm that he's going to continue to be this fantasy MVP that we saw several years ago before all the injuries with the Carolina Panthers, and that we're getting this year with the San Francisco 49ers.
Shawn, over the last couple of weeks since we would have talked, there's quite a few running backs and their kind of, I guess, committees at this particular point that have been either forced or they had been that way, or players coming back from injury. In the case of, say, Jonathan Taylor with Zach Mostert, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers, Jalen Warren, Najee Harris. There's a lot of rooms around the NFL at the moment where there's competition one way or the other. We've seen Chuba Hubbard get a bigger workload last week over Miles Sanders. We'll see how that continues. And the other one then feels like injury related was the Seattle Seahawks with Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker. Looking around, it doesn't have to be specifically those, but is there any of those backfields that when you were looking into them this week, you thought that the information you've seen might be slightly different to what people may be taking away from those recent week performances?
Well, some of the most controversial backfields here, you mentioned the Seahawks, and I love Kenneth Walker. He had a huge run in this game that you don't get unless you have his level of talent. But I did recommend trading him. If you're in one of these redraft leagues where a lot of trading goes on and you really are trying to move your roster around to point toward the playoffs themselves, I think that there are reasons to be concerned about where he is now. Because one of the things is Zach Charbonnet, not the same level of explosiveness, and yet it's a good fit for him in this offense. Anytime you're a downhill runner who also is a flexible receiver, we go back to the reason that Charbonnet was on the 0 RB running back list in the first place, and kind of the joke being that it was very, very grudgingly because Kenneth Walker was such a big target for us overall. But yet I think we're seeing right now a little bit of a transition, the type of transition a lot of people felt was going to happen with the Jaguars, but not, right? And one of the things is that unlike Charbonnet, Tank Bigsby not playing well, he gets a little bit of a chance there in week 8 when Travis Etienne gets dinged up and immediately fumbles. And so, again, you get a much wider moat for Etienne. You love to see that. He's having a fantastic season. You hate to see it happen because of an injury, but anytime that a back isn't 100%, the NFL teams have to be so careful with them, and then that does open up some other possibilities. We're seeing, vaguely similar things at a lower level with the Miami Dolphins, where Raheem Mostert isn't quite 100%, and you end up having this committee with Jeff Wilson and Salvon Ahmed. Obviously, if you've been waiting for Wilson to get out there and make his presence felt after how well the Miami Dolphins rushing attack has scored to this point, and with Achane probably coming back fairly soon as well. So you have the Dolphins in Kansas City against, well, not in Kansas City, in Germany against Kansas City. Then you have the bye. Then you get Achane back. The Ahmed role here, where it's a three-way committee instead of just the two-man team, that part, I think, becomes pretty tough. We had a similar dynamic with the Cleveland Browns, where Jerome Ford has played extremely well, but isn't quite healthy. Kareem Hunt, I mean, he's one of the only guys here, but we've kind of been joking throughout the season, mostly in frustration that, Rhamondre Stevenson has been awful, and that has been disappointing. But Ezekiel Elliott's peripherals are still so bad that even with as bad as Rhamondre Stevenson is or has been, how disappointing he has been, the Patriots need to lean into that and get him a chance to really get going, as opposed to throwing away these touches. You only have so many plays in an NFL game. For Elliot to siphon some of those feels like a real loss for them as they try to jumpstart their team. Because what's the only way that the New England Patriots get back and start to make a push? Well, it's going to rely on Rhamondre Stevenson jumping back to stardom, because they have no other talent, right? There aren't other players on that team where you could say, oh, if they had 2 or 3 huge games and started to look more like themselves, that would even be a good thing, right? There's no world in which Devontae Parker makes any difference, that Juju Smith-Schuster makes any difference. It's got to be Rhamondre Stevenson or bust. But the thing there that we kind of joked about throughout the season, before that little mini digression, is that Ezekiel Elliott, sort of the last guy to log a broken or forced missed tackle, at least by the Sports Info Solutions charter. So you're going to have some slightly different characterization depending on what source you're using. We get this wealth of amazing information from SIS. So anybody who is interested in that, make sure you check out the Advanced Stat Explorer. Make sure you check out the Advanced Team Stat Explorer. So much cool stuff there. But you look at this Cleveland Browns team, Kareem Hunt now is the last guy, right? Gus Edwards finally got in the scorebook. Ezekiel Elliott finally got in the scorebook. Kareem Hunt is not yet, but he's getting the most important touches here in this Cleveland Browns offense. If you are like us and you have some Jerome Ford, losing those touches to Kareem Hunt is disappointing. And then definitely if you are in the desperation situation, and again, are like us where you're a huge Pierre Strong fan, to have Hunt take those touches is disappointing. You have another game here where Pierre Strong actually looked really good as the third man. He has a 40-yard catch. He generates a lot of value on his handful of rushing touches. You'd love to see in the situation where the top 2 guys aren't completely healthy, them lean into Pierre Strong, maybe call him. The Browns are going to go back in and they're going to look at the tape and they're going to say, you know what? Maybe we win this game if we give Pierre Strong a little bit more. Again, the bye weeks are here in a huge way in week 9, where at least for the RotoViz OT community, this is the week that everybody is out. Pierre Strong is going to be playing on some teams for me. You don't want that to be the case, right? You're not projecting Pierre Strong for many touches, and anytime you don't get many touches, you're looking at a potential 0. But Colm, he looked very good. This is an interesting backfield. Obviously, Nick Chubb was the guy. He's not going to be there. Did you have a chance to watch this game? What are your thoughts on the Cleveland Browns and Pierre Strong? It's a pipe dream, right? We're not going to suddenly get 10-plus touches for Pierre Strong in week 9.
I don't think so. I think it's a case that he's going to be added in for a limited amount of plays here at the moment. And at the moment, it's a case that the plays are that limited. I don't see that he's going to make a big enough impact to stretch that roll out over the next couple of weeks. I think it's going to kind of stay in the formation that it's in at the moment. You mentioned the Cleveland Browns and what my feelings are. My feelings are the less you can watch of the Cleveland Browns, usually the more enjoyable. But I did get to catch this game, and I think that they're going to be a three-headed committee moving forward. And I think Pierre Strong, unfortunately, Shawn, over the next, looking a month ahead, I think he's going to be the third option as much as we want him to get factored in, barring injury. But those limited touches that he is having, he's looking pretty good. But there's a potential, Shawn, that's also our biased eye factoring in there when we're looking at them. Just to give a few notes that Shawn has mentioned in here that I really enjoyed since I recorded with Blair earlier this week. Leonard Fournette did sign with the Buffalo Bills. Shawn mentions in it that the former Jag and Buck does everything, but he does everything poorly. So that is, I think, a true statement. And Shawn trying to, I think, be as kind as possible there.
Well, my take on it is almost a little bit the other way around, where it works in this other direction, right? Where Leonard Fournette does everything poorly, but he does everything.
Yeah.
And that's appealing to teams, right? If you can do everything, they don't have to take you off the field. They're not necessarily telegraphing the play call.
So it's better to do everything poorly than to do some things good.
It really depends. The unfortunate part is that you get the impression from NFL teams, and this is a little bit the thing with Ezekiel Elliott, right? It's like, why did they move Pierre Strong, who is a dynamic player, for Ezekiel Elliott, who's washed up? Well, because they wanted to have a guy who stylistically was similar to Rhamondre Stevenson so that you could move those guys in and out interchangeably and not telegraph the plays. You do get the impression that a lot of the weirdness that's occurred with the New England Patriots offense over the last 2 years, and even some of the rhetoric coming out of New England, was about things that Bill Belichick wanted to do differently because he and Josh McDaniels hadn't seen eye to eye on them. Now, with the embarrassing end to the McDaniels era in Las Vegas, you can understand even a little bit more, perhaps, why that was the case. The thing that we're seeing here with both of these coaches, and I think that in some ways it's too bad. I've never been a Patriots fan. I've never been a Belichick fan. I think that the borderline cheating, and it really probably is borderline. There's just so much we still don't really know about all of the stuff that happened kind of in that 20-year window and whether it really was cheating or was just sour grapes from other teams. But I love the fact that with Bill Belichick, you seem to have someone who was focusing on the big picture, but then also all of the details, and was so concerned about taking every possible edge and stacking all of these edges. And then I think that even if you don't like a certain team, coach, player, it's just so important in life to give credit to people for the accomplishments that they've had. If you aren't the kind of person who gives credit to other people when they succeed, then you're creating this very weird dynamic and environment for yourself as you try to work to be successful, because you're not, really thinking through things in either a logical or an ethical way, again, in terms of understanding what it takes and giving credit for accomplishment. So you look at that with Bill Belichick. Certainly those Patriot teams were a true dynasty over this 2-decade period, and yet now it just looks so clear like it was Tom Brady, both for him, for his offensive coordinators, for all of these different people. I mean, in some ways, I think that's unfortunate, right? Because, Tom Brady is something of a villain character as well. But we now get back to this, and we're thinking about the New England Patriots, and you got the impression that even though it was wildly successful, that Bill Belichick didn't love having all of these niche running back roles to where the opposing team was getting some type of signal on the play call by the running back personnel. They talked about so much kind of last offseason, they wanted to run this Shanahan type of offense and a much more simple offense than what McDaniels ran, because they felt like a lot of their wide receiver misses in personnel were based on an offense that was too complicated. Well, all of those things appear to have not really been the case, and they continue to do all kinds of things where it's like, it's not the offense when you're making personnel decisions to let Jacoby Myers walk while you're signing Juju Smith-Schuster, right? These are just big and obvious mistakes. And yet those types of things are kind of interesting. And it is a weird and unfortunate dynamic when the Patriots continue to apparently chase mistake after mistake after mistake. And this decision at the running back position is yet another one. And yet it does underline this idea that there's some value to be had in being able to do a variety of things, even if you don't do them well. It's one of the reasons I think that Kareem Hunt is appealing. And it's certainly the reason that a Leonard Fournette would be appealing. It does worry me as a James Cook fan. One of the things that I note in this particular piece is that over the first 3 weeks, Cook averaged 4.3 targets per game. Over the most recent 5, just 1.6, right? So that first group, especially if you're getting some good rush numbers, you can be a low-end RB1. That second group, I mean, you're looking at James Cook now as being not even startable, right? Now, again, this week you would be starting him because you have all the bye week concerns. But if you have your full roster, James Cook is not really somebody that you want to have in there. When you think about him being like a round 5-6 turn player, that's not ideal for him to be a healthy guy you don't really want in the game anymore. And I think it's unfortunate because he's flashed so much talent. And yet the Bills, as they've gone through this weird season where they did things like, I mean, you watch the Patriots play again in week 8. And I mean, how did they possibly defeat the Buffalo Bills in week 7? But the Bills have basically had this game that Kansas City had against Denver. They've had it 3 different times already this year. And that starts to undermine your confidence in what you're doing. They wanted to be this 2 tight end offense where they would have a lot of flexibility because the tight ends are also receivers, but then you can go heavier and you can run on teams a little bit more with intention as opposed to being a one-off. They realize that it's not necessarily working. And in part, you get away from it because of some injuries. And you're like, oh, I mean, having, the additional receiver out there helps. But then what do we want to do with James Cook? This is still a team that, despite having Josh Allen, they don't really have an offensive identity. And Colm, you talked a lot about the QB injuries. Obviously, if you have injuries, if you're losing a Kirk Cousins, that is devastating. That's going to be a much bigger problem than simply, being one of these power teams that maybe isn't where they want to be. But it's mind-boggling to be at this point of the 2023 season and to have the Bills not really have an identity, to have the Chiefs not really have an identity. They've come out of it in a little bit more positive way in the last several weeks, but I think you can still make the claim that the Cincinnati Bengals have not really established identity. And you think about the challenge that 2023 offers, and thankfully we've gotten a really fun season. Ben and I, on the Stealing Bananas episode that just released, that was sort of our first show in a couple of weeks, kind of went through some of these global trends and how they fit into our talent-based fantasy drafting approach and how powerful the teams are looking right now and how cool that is. So this has been a great year, and I love those elements. And yet you can have that be the case and have us also be in this weird environment where, I mean, just imagine how difficult it is for the Atlanta Falcons as they're trying to work through their quarterback issues. You imagine what the situation is like for the rookie QBs. You think about the Jekyll and Hyde season that we've gotten from Sam Howell, and you put that in the context of the very best teams with the very best quarterbacks are having these problems establishing an identity for themselves. It's that much more difficult for the teams that don't have that much talent. And, you can look at that as being a negative of the 2023 season, but really it's just more of a fascinating puzzle piece where there's a lot to still happen in this tug of war between defenses that are evolving to take away the big play and to force offenses to execute a lot of positive plays. Teams like the Bills and the Chiefs are still trying to figure out how to do that. How do you execute enough plays, and how do you develop some of your pieces? I mean, frankly, the Chiefs have missed on a lot of their picks. And when they're coming off of these 6 AFC championship games, when they're coming off of, 3 Super Bowl appearances, 2 Super Bowl victories, you're like, I mean, again, these are huge first world problems if you're the Kansas City Chiefs, and maybe you need a little bit more talent on offense. But the fact of the matter remains that you can only miss so many picks and have it not be an issue. The Chiefs have missed. 2023 requires a lot of talent to put together one of these offenses like the Miami Dolphins have put together. Give them a lot of credit. And because of the way so many fantasy leagues are now structured, the season feels like it's really deep into the year. The actual NFL reality season is less than half over. There's going to be a lot to still happen as these teams try and solve these problems that they have out ahead of them.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Like when we're looking at, and this even from league to league. So if we're looking at, let's say, the FFPC main event versus the best ball leagues versus your own home leagues, and the structure of where the playoffs start, where the playoffs end, then you actually have to factor in that the NFL season continues on beyond that. So there's a lot of, when we're looking at the fantasy season, like you mentioned there, so much is going to change both in that, but and that's going to be driven by what changes in the NFL. Two running backs, Sean, I just want to get final thoughts on, because they're two of our favorites. But Breece Hall obviously had a long catch and run for a touchdown this past week, which kind of saved his day a little bit from a fantasy perspective, but also showed the upside that he has as an elite talent. What are your thoughts on Hall now, rest of the season moving forward here with the Jets? And who knows, with the rate of recovery it looks like Aaron Rodgers has, maybe he'll be back in here before we know it. But with Zach Wilson in there, how are you feeling about, we have a lot of shares of Breece Hall. What's your optimistic, I guess, confidence level on him moving forward here?
Well, one of the things that I've tried to really emphasize to myself in 2023 is that you just have to be ready for the teams to do things that don't make sense. You can't get out there and assume rational decision making and assume they're going to do the right thing, and then when they don't, be devastated, because they're just not going to. And so you don't want to set yourself up for all that heartache. When the Arizona Cardinals come out for the season and their biggest playmaker is Trey McBride, but he is buried behind like a 1,000-year-old Zach Ertz, don't be surprised by that. It's just par for the course. It's just what's going to happen at different junctures, right? So
took a lot of I was going to say, the point you were making is to try and have emotional maturity and to handle things like the teams mightn't handle it rationally, but you try and handle it rationally as the season goes on. But Sean, there's some of these decisions it's hard to handle rationally here. When the Trey McBride one now looks to be just baffling. Idiotic, maybe, would be another word I would use for it. But
we did manage to work in a little bit of a criticism of the Cardinals in that sort of big picture take there. But no, you look at what the Minnesota Vikings did after the injury to Kirk Cousins to get Joshua Dobbs, and you're like, the injury to Aaron Rodgers occurred months ago.
It occurred on the first play of the season for the New York Jets, Sean. So it occurred 8 weeks ago, 2 months ago.
And then on top of that, we now have had this window closed that could actually, we're now.
They might get a free agent quarterback, maybe? No?
Yeah, if they're going to be a lot of NFL teams out there cutting their very legitimate backups, then maybe they get somebody.
Oh, my word.
It's frustrating, right? Because every time that you get one of these games from Breece Hall where he completely transcends the environment, and you're like, yeah, that's why I drafted him. That's why, he could be the 101 next year, even though, obviously the 101 is going to be Jefferson or McCaffrey or Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill. It's going to be one of those guys because he's that good and he'll be able to do it every week. And, the next week he has a 70-yard touchdown run. You're like, yeah, he's that good. The problem is just, even if you're that good, those plays can't happen every week. And when your offense is this bad, you're set up to have like a 6 or 7 point game in the other weeks. So the overall scoring level is going to be frustrating. You hope that he continues to do so much of what we've seen. You hope that the weather is good. One of the things is just the New York Jets are not the kind of team that can afford to be playing in a storm like every second or third week. Now, I know that with the time of the year that it is and where they're located, again, you're probably going to have to put up with some of that stuff too. But one of the things that we start to see going forward here as we get into November is that you just desperately want good luck for your teams that are in that kind of Northeast area that, every week you have that weather risk. Maybe they can go on a good run of weather. So you look at that, Breece Hall, 105 fewer routes than Bijan Robinson, and yet the same yardage numbers there. He's at 2.4 yards per route in the way that SIS puts it together. That's better than most receivers. His receiving evasion rate of 47%, again, trumps Bijan there at 27%. And this isn't in any way, shape, or form to be like, oh, Bijan Robinson is just another guy. Bijan Robinson isn't as good as Breece Hall. I mean, Bijan might still be better. But as we're looking at players who have that size athleticism combination, it's really extraordinary that Hall could be that much better. It also underlines what Robinson can potentially do now that you have Taylor Heineke involved. I mean, I made the case that Bijan Robinson's scoring level right now is actually not particularly good. Certainly if you drafted him, 106, 107, 108, it hasn't done what you needed. I still think that even with that being the case, you probably can't trade for him. And yet, if you have some guys like a Kenneth Walker, I mean, even though Walker has outscored him, you're going to have to give more than just Walker to get Bijan. But I think that you might want to go out there and do that. I think that Robinson is also, again, just one of these players who's so unique that if people are saying, okay, well, Arthur Smith and the quarterback situation is just so bad, and obviously one of the reasons that Bijan doesn't have a great overall score is he had that week where he himself was sick, and people end up having to take almost a 0 there. That part was very unfortunate. I think you want to go out and get him. I think that you want to continue to figure out ways to target the true stars. I mentioned trying to move Alvin Kamara for Austin Eckler. Obviously, Kamara has scored a lot more points. His route number is extremely high. His target number is extremely high. He's been scoring touchdowns. Kamara's peripherals are not good, and Austin Eckler has this amazing future schedule. I mean, that's a very specific type of trade recommendation. Most people aren't going to be maybe in that specific of a moment or situation to where they can really get that done. But you can look at the article and figure out some possible exploitable opportunities. Certainly, you can go in there and play with the fantasy strength of schedule streamer. You can look at Blair's article. You can look at the advanced team stat explorer and kind of see where there might be some edges that you can use in your particular league. And one of the things that I would say is that, if you're heading toward the playoffs, don't be so risk averse that you don't make a move that might make you better just because it might make you worse. I mean, really, we're at the exact same point that you're in when the season starts, which is that every pick that you make, there are other choices, and those other choices might work out better. And if you're going to be involved in the whole activity in the first place, you've got to have the confidence and you've got to have the willingness to make mistakes, which means making a pick where a different pick might be better. You can make a trade. Once you've selected that initial team, sometimes you look at it and like, anything that I do here has to be a win. I can't afford to ruin this nice team that I put together. But if you have a league where trades do happen and other managers you're interacting with where you can make some moves, if you don't make a move, not making it can be just the same as making it in terms of the risk. If you don't make the move that would have allowed you to win, you can look at that at the end of the year and say, if only I'd had the guts. So my recommendation would be to enjoy the tools, to enjoy the game, certainly, enjoy making moves, and don't be scared to do something that, might backfire. You don't know what the future is going to bring. All you can do is take the information you have now and make the best decisions. Colm, I think this is a really fun year to do some of those things. You were mentioning some research that Hayden had put out there talking about these are the running back hits within, or, really just the draft in general, but certainly looking at the dead zone. We've had Jake Boyce do really cool work on best ball every single week. Anybody who is focused a lot on that and trying to understand how the shape of scoring influences advance rates, influences how teams move through the season and get you where you want to be in something like Best Ball Mania. Make sure you check out his articles. One of the things he's talked about a lot is the running back dead zone is still there. As we discussed this season and said, okay, look, we're going to make some risky picks in this range. It wasn't saying, the running back dead zone doesn't exist from the perspective of there aren't going to still be more landmines than hits. One of the things that you were mentioning to me before the show is that so many of the guys who were actually hitting out of these ranges are the people we were recommending. Obviously, not going to be perfect on that. Rhamondre Stevenson has been, massively disappointing, and people do note that to me with some frustration. But the right profile at these prices has been so cool for 2023. We want to take the structural approach that we know has been winning for over a decade, and yet also take the individual player profiles and say, this is how we put together power teams in 2023. This is how you put together a potential championship team. There's a long way to go. But the things that we're watching, especially over this last month, and the hard part with the NFL is because you only play a game once a week, as opposed to, say, an NBA game or MLB game. It does imbue those games that do happen on those Sundays with so much importance and visibility that when there are guys you really wanted to do well and they don't, it is a dagger. And then you've got to spend all week with that, and it can undermine your faith in either the player or the process. But also because it's a short week in terms of you only get so many weeks and then you're at the playoffs. And if your guys didn't hit soon enough, it doesn't matter that maybe your overall thesis was okay. But I've loved 2023 because it's reminded us that what happens in the first month isn't the only thing that's going to happen. And if you were to stop the season at that point, we'd be looking at guys like Jahmyr Gibbs, who, Colm, we were extremely high on him. He flashed in week 1, but didn't get exactly the scoring because he fell down when he was going to actually score a touchdown. Then you have David Montgomery putting up these monster numbers. You get some mild injuries for Gibbs. You have Devin Achane doing the things that we had talked about with Gibbs, and it's easy to be like, oh, this is a miss. Gibbs is actually just a guy. Achane is the player that everybody should have been on. You watch that game on Monday night against the Raiders, and granted, it's the Raiders. They're hours away from having like their entire team fired. It's an easier environment than some, but Gibbs looked like peak Jamal Charles. And if you don't wait for some of that to play out, then, you can be like, Gibbs is just a guy. Gibbs is not just a guy. Jahmyr Gibbs is astonishingly, good. He's exciting. He's fast. And we haven't even really seen the receiving stuff yet, even though he catches 5 passes in that game. I don't know, right? David Montgomery is there. It is a problem when they're both healthy, but Gibbs, incredibly exciting. Obviously, we've discussed a lot with Trey McBride. For a while there, it looked like Mayer was going to be a bust. Then you get the huge game. Now you get this kind of retraction. Now you have a new QB. You're going to have a new coaching staff. We don't know where that's going to go. You mentioned the McBride is going to be in there for us this week where Laporta is out. That would be a lot more exciting if they weren't making a QB change and weren't going to get a mid-round rookie out there playing. And yet, who knows? Maybe Clayton Tune will play well. And regardless of how well he plays, it's hard to see that offense functioning at all if McBride doesn't get 10 to 12 targets. And so the volume at least should be there. I don't know. I don't know if you can tell, Colm, but I'm pretty fired up to be back. I'm pretty excited to record with you. I'm excited for how the season is going. It's Thursday afternoon here as record. Fired up for tonight. Can't wait for week 9.
Yeah, I'm excited for week 9. And but I kind of joked about it earlier, but people taking victory laps at an early point of the season. And that kind of shows up again that either players that you think you're so right on at a certain point after 2 or 3 weeks, or that you're so wrong on. These things do take time to play out. And you mentioned it particularly there with a number of the most recent guys, somebody like even a Gibbs, moving forward, we'll see what happens. But there's so many of these scenarios that change. If you look at the NFL as 4-week periods, that, what after 4 weeks is different to 8 weeks, is different to 12 weeks, and it's continuing to evolve. But yeah, very excited for week 9 here as we move forward. The piece that, or the information you mentioned that we were talking about before with Hayden Winks, a tweet that he did looking at some of the running backs, and really the only running backs from kind of the start of the 3rd round through pick kind of 100 that have hit so far this season in terms of they're currently ranked above their ADP are Travis Etienne is 33 spots ahead, Breece Hall is 20 spots ahead, Kenneth Walker is 30 spots ahead, James Cook's 15 spots ahead, but as we mentioned today, that could be under some threat. We have David Montgomery 51 spots ahead, Kamara 64, and then when we start to get down into this, DeAndre Swift 63, Pacheco 51, and Brian Robinson 55. And out of those, there's names in there that we weren't actively targeting, but the names in the dead zone, or the traditional dead zone that we would have been talking about, the likes of an Etienne, the likes of, moving down through that list of DeAndre Swift, some of the guys would have been in Sean Zero RB list, Kenneth Walker as well in there. there is those profiles, and that's when we're always talking about the profiles. Shawn mentioned a number of times on today's show the talent level of these players that you're trying to target, and those are the guys that are clicking, are hitting, and sometimes those guys take a little bit of time to work in, whether it's injury related with the likes of a Breece Hall trying to get back to 100%. The other player, Shawn, I wanted to talk about, we're going to leave it today. We'll talk about it because there is a bye week. We can talk about it ahead of NFL Week 10 is Javonte Williams as he kind of continues his way back from injury. But lots of stuff like that has me excited as the season continues to move forward here. Shawn mentioned Thursday Night Football. This will be coming out after Thursday Night Football. But Shawn, we are firing Will Levis up in our main event team. So we'll see how that goes. Listeners can see if we're in a good mood or a bad mood come Friday based on that information. But we have a Jared Goff team with Matthew Stafford. Stafford maybe not going to be in action this week. So going with the rookie. We'll see what happens there. But again, excited to see these rookies stepping forward. Maybe a JSN. Maybe we get Marvin Mims getting more work done. But excited for the rest of the season, Shawn. So we are ready to go. The last thing I want to mention on today's show is we talked today about some of the teams and how they're going. Shawn, I continue to get people reaching out to say mid-season review, review these teams, tell us how you're going. And they're talking about their teams as well and how good their season's going. So maybe we should, maybe next week we'll try and squeeze it into the end of the week show as to talk about some of these teams. If they win again this week and they're in good shape, we want to talk about them, but they are in good shape at the moment. But yeah, a review of how things are, that because we're kind of past the halfway point down at that stage. But that is going to do it for today's edition of RotoViz Overtime. Excuse my long soliloquy here at the end of the show. But good luck to everyone in NFL Week 9. Hopefully you get that win. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMartin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.